Welcome. This is a reading of the essay, The Promise Plan, Unity and Consciousness in Messianic Prophecy. Abstract. Contemporary biblical scholarship often presents the canonical scriptures as a collection of divergent theological perspectives. Classical systematic frameworks frequently impose post-biblical administrative or philosophical categories onto the text. This study explores the organic unity and progressive development of Scripture through the promise plan of God, as articulated by Walter C. Kaiser Jr. and rooted in the work of Willis J. Beecher. Focusing on messianic promises in Kaiser's Recovering the Unity of the Bible, it examines the antiquity of the messianic hope, the nature of prophetic consciousness, and the limitations of sensus plenior. Drawing on E.D. Hirsch's distinction between fixed meaning and unfolding significance, and examining 1 Peter chapter 1 verses 10 through 11 and Acts chapter 2 verses 30 through 31, the essay shows that the Old Testament prophets possessed a conscious, though partial, understanding of the messianic promises they recorded. The argument situates the promise plan within its ancient Hebraic cognitive environment and the divine counsel worldview, offering a non-supersessionist alternative that preserves both the concrete future of ethnic Israel and the full inclusion of Gentile believers within the one people of God. Section 1. Introduction. The methodological crisis in Messianic interpretation. For over 2 centuries, academic biblical studies have faced a methodological crisis regarding the coherence of the Christian canon. Influenced by post-Enlightenment historical critical paradigms, mainstream scholarship has often characterized the Old and New Testaments as an anthology of conflicting traditions. Messianic prophecy is frequently reduced to late intertestamental projections or retrospective Christian reinterpretations. Conversely, classical dispensationalism rightly preserves the concrete, literal promises made to ethnic Israel, yet introduces discontinuities by partitioning redemptive history into discrete administrative ages. Classical covenant theology correctly emphasizes the unity of God's purpose, yet frequently spiritualizes the land, temple, and ethnic promises, risking structural supersessionism. Biblical theology must recover an organizing center that emerges organically from the final canonical form. That center is the promise plan of God, a single, progressive, and cumulative divine declaration unfolding from Genesis to Revelation. Central to this plan is the Messiah. The messianic promises possess a deliberate organic architecture. The ancient prophets consciously understood them as a single, unfolding promise, kept alive through historical links and culminating in Jesus the Christ. Section 2. The Antiquity and Genesis of the Messianic Hope. A common critical claim holds that a clear expectation of a personal eschatological Messiah did not exist until the late Second Temple period. Kaiser dismantles this late-date hypothesis by tracing the progressive revelation of the messianic promise from the foundational strata of Scripture. The trajectory unfolds across key milestones: the proto-evangelium in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, the promise of the seed of the woman who will crush the head of the serpent, the Shemite blessing in Genesis chapter 9 verse 27, the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 and chapter 17 verses 1 through 8, the promise of seed, land, and universal blessing to all the families of the earth, the tribal scepter of Judah in Genesis chapter 49 verse 10, and the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verses 12 through 16 and Psalm 89, the perpetual royal dynasty whose throne endures forever. The messianic hope was not a late human invention born of political despair. It was a continuous cumulative stream kept alive by God through specific historic means, dynasties, families, and covenantal oaths. Section 3. Hermeneutical Foundations, Prophetic Consciousness, and the Critique of Sensus Plenior. A major debate concerns whether the New Testament writers discovered meanings in Old Testament messianic prophecies that were entirely hidden from the human authors. This concept, known as sensus plenior or fuller sense, asserts that God placed a deeper hidden meaning of which the human author was completely unconscious. Kaiser rejects sensus plenior. If a meaning was completely hidden from the human instrument, The writer becomes a mere mechanical tool, and the resulting text cannot properly be called written scripture in the human historical sense. Instead, Kaiser draws on E.D. Hirsch's distinction between meaning and significance. Meaning is the stable sense of a text bound to the author's intentional decision at the time of composition. Significance is the variable relationship of that fixed meaning to new contexts and successive stages of revelation. New Testament writers do not invent new meanings. They identify the progressive realization of the original fixed meaning. The apostles themselves affirm prophetic consciousness. In Acts chapter 2, verses 30 through 31, Peter declares that David was a prophet who knew that God had sworn an oath to set one of his descendants on his throne, and that David, foreseeing this, spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah. 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 10 through 11 shows that the prophets searched concerning the salvation that would come to later generations. The Spirit of Christ in them testified beforehand to the sufferings of Christ and the subsequent glories. On this reading, the prophets knew 5 realities. They wrote about the Messiah, they understood his predicted sufferings, they understood his subsequent glory, they knew the sequence. Suffering must precede glory, and they knew their writings were intended for future generations. Their inquiry concerned only the exact historical timeline of fulfillment. Section 4. The Architecture of the Promise Plan. The foundational insight comes from Willis J. Beecher's 1905 work, The Prophets and the Promise. Messianic prophecy is not a series of scattered, independent predictions. It is a single, continuous, and cumulative promise. God made a promise to Abraham and through him to all mankind, a promise fulfilled in the history of Israel and mainly fulfilled in Jesus Christ. The one promise plan incorporates many specifications: the virgin birth in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, the Bethlehem birthplace in Micah chapter 5 verse 2, the triumphal entry in Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9, the betrayal for 30 pieces of silver in Zechariah chapter 11 verses 12 through 13, and the vicarious atonement in Isaiah chapter 53 verses 4 through 6. These are distinct strands woven into a single pattern. Paul summarizes the gospel as the fulfillment of what God promised the fathers, Acts chapter 13 verses 32 through 33, and Acts chapter 26 verse 6. Hermeneutical integrity requires consistency. If the promise plan is a unified whole, the literal fulfillment of the Messiah's suffering necessarily includes the future, literal realization of his worldwide reign and the concrete promises made to ethnic Israel. Section 5. Engaging alternative theological frameworks. Classical dispensationalism rightly affirms the irrevocable physical and national promises to ethnic Israel, yet its segmentation into isolated programs tends to obscure the continuous nature of the one promise plan. Classical covenant theology rightly emphasizes the unity of the people of God, yet by subjecting the text to post-canonical categories, it often spiritualizes the land, temple, and ethnic promises, risking structural supersessionism. Promise plan theology centers on the text immanent promise. It traces progressive organic development within the canon. The result is a single, continuous people of God. Gentiles are included in Israel's commonwealth without replacing ethnic Israel. As Paul explains in Romans chapter 11, Gentile believers are grafted into the existing olive root of Israel. God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. A future national salvation awaits ethnic Israel. Section 6. Cosmic horizons and Hebraic cognitive patterns. Ancient Hebraic thought holds complementary realities side by side without requiring immediate logical synthesis: the sovereignty of God and human responsibility, the special election of Israel and the universal blessing for the nations. The promise plan operates within a cosmic context of threefold rebellion: the fall in Eden in Genesis chapter 3, the transgression of the Watchers in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, and the disinheritance at Babel in Genesis chapter 11 and Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 through 9. Yahweh's selection of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 is a direct response aimed at regaining the nations. The promise plan is the Creator's initiative to disarm rebellious spiritual powers, restore the nations through the seed of Abraham, and reestablish unmediated divine presence in a restored cosmic temple, culminating in the New Jerusalem of Revelation chapters 21 and 22. Conclusion. The 66 books of the biblical canon are neither a collection of conflicting human traditions nor texts forced into post-biblical systems. Scripture possesses an unbreakable organic unity held together by God's promise plan. That plan is present from the earliest chapters, continues through the patriarchal and Davidic covenants, and is consciously recognized by the Old Testament prophets. By adhering to the single trajectory of the promise, the model offers a non-supersessionist alternative that preserves the specific, future-oriented promises to ethnic Israel while fully including Gentile believers within the one people of God. Ultimately, the promise plan discloses a unified and victorious divine story, the Creator's determined purpose to overcome the forces of darkness, to redeem a multi-ethnic family, and to dwell eternally in a restored cosmic temple,